Hi everyone, this is Tanya with Flying Dog Studio. Thank you so much for joining me. And this particular piece, we will be looking at another botanical study, and again with pears. If you would like to take a look at some of these that I do, if you want references from those as well, you can find them at Wikimedia Commons, and I'll put that link down below. I'm also going to put the link to our previous botanical study, because this piece actually builds upon some techniques we learned in the previous piece. But we're doing things a little bit more involved with this one. This will be my last botanical study for a while. We're going to be taking a look at some other things. So let's get started with the tools. I am using the Royal and Langnickel brushes. This is their Zen series. I have a round size 8 and a round size 2 brush. And then I will also be using the scrubber, and if you've watched another video, you know I call this my magic eraser because it does erase things for you. The Windsor & Newton Pocket Watercolor half pans are what I'm using for this. And if you can't see my colors, because I know my pad gets off the screen just a little bit, I will have those listed for you as we're working along. Now, I drew this out with a mechanical pencil, but it's not necessary to use a mechanical. You can use any kind of pencil you like. This is a Micron 0.1, and I did use that to trace around my lines. And then I have a white plastic eraser to get rid of all of my pencil marks. Now, one thing that we're going to be doing, I'm starting out here doing some wet on wet, and I'm going to be putting the colors on the pears. And the reason I want to start with wet, which means I'm going to put some water on the pears, don't want them to be like a puddle. I always tell my students, make it shiny, but don't make it a puddle. And I'm going to pre-mix my colors right up here at the top in this little pan where we can mix those up there. And again, I'll have those colors listed on the screen. But by putting the water down first, since the pears are two different colors, I want the reds and the greens to kind of merge together. So you're going to see that I'm going to put down the water and then put the colors on the pears so those can kind of mesh together. Alright, you'll notice that I'm using the tip of my brush to get that water exactly where I want it. If you'll remember, wherever you put the water, that is where the paint will go. And I can do almost everything with this size 8. Even though this is kind of a small piece, we do have some tiny areas. If you will hold that brush on its tip and make it perpendicular with the paper, and you'll notice that I do that because the camera gets a little out of focus as the end of my brush gets close to the lens there. But that will allow you to paint in small places. And by using a larger brush, it's going to hold more water and more paint, and you don't have to go back as often, and you can just keep painting. you can see the benefit of putting the water down first to allow all of those colors to kind of run together. And my brush is also loaded with water and paint, so that allows me to come back and move that paint around a little bit more. Okay, now we're going to get into a little bit different technique. We're going to start on the leaves. And you'll notice I have not put water down first. So this is called wet on dry. So the paper's dry and the paint is wet, but I do have enough water in my brush that's going to allow me to move the paint around just as if I were working on wet on wet. Now, the reason I did not wet the paper is because I want this color to be a little more concentrated. I'm not using two different colors that I need to move together, but I do want to put some extra greens in there. So because I've kept the color wet, even though I didn't wet the paper, I've kept my brush nice and full of water, and I'm using some extra colors here. You can see I'm adding some green. It's going to allow that to move through the green I already have down, and it's going to give us some nice variation in green. So you're going to see me do this on the rest of the leaves and also on the stems. So I'm going to be quiet now and just let you watch me paint. All right, you can see that we have gotten some nice greens, some light greens and some dark greens on all of these leaves. And now I'm adding some of that burnt sienna to my green. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want a darker, almost an olive, a dark olive color that I can use on some of the underside of these leaves because they have almost a dead look to them. So I'm going to be using that in different areas of the stems, like where the leaves and the pears are coming off of the main stem, and that's going to give it a little more variation in color. And you can see right there where my color on the pear where I was painting on the stem and on this one, it's pulled up just a little bit. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to be careful not to drag our hands through it. I'm very bad about doing that. So we're just going to let that dry. It's going to seep in and give us some nice texture. Now that we have the base colors on everything, I'm coming back and I'm adding a second coat of color. And I do like to do this to get more detail with my work. And I am simply taking the original colors I used and I'm darkening them up just a bit. I like to start light with those base colors, and then I like to add more pigment, so we're having less water and more pigment in our brush, and that allows us to get these dark, deep colors. Now I'm working wet on dry. At this point, we're not going to re-wet our paper. We're simply going to make certain we have enough water and pigment in our brush that we can paint straight on to the pears that we've already put the color down. So I'm going to be using the same process through the entire piece. Once I have my base colors down, I'm coming back and making more color, using more pigment and less water so that I can get additional detail in all of these elements of the piece. And sometimes I'll add 3, maybe even 4 layers to a piece depending on how much detail I feel I need. And each time I am using less water and more pigment. Now we don't want it thick like acrylic paint. It is watercolor, and the first word there is water, so we want to make sure it's nice and liquid, but we don't want to use so much liquid that we're just putting another light layer on. We want to keep adding some more pigment in. And as I do this, again, you see I'm still using that size 8 brush. I'm simply using the tip of it so that I can get some nice detail. And I'm also, you'll notice, I'm not just painting, I'm dabbing that paint in. So once you have, and it takes practice, you'll get the feel of it. Once you get the water and the pigment on your brush, you're just kind of tapping into small areas to add that color. And you'll see I do have a little spot right there where I told you I'm bad about dipping my hands and stuff. This is a clean brush with water, and I simply ran it over the top, and that mistake is completely gone. and you will notice that I am not painting. I'm working on the stems and on the backs of leaves right now. And in some areas, I may paint an entire section to get the color I need. And in some areas, like on the stems, I won't paint the entire stem. I'm only going to paint a portion of it. So it's not necessary to paint the entire thing. We are looking now for shades. We are looking for different textures, and those are the things that I am adding into the piece. You are actually getting to watch me use my tiny brush because the tops of those pears, I felt like I wanted to make certain I didn't make any more mistakes. And by this point, I had already, even off camera, there were areas that I had to remove some paint where I got a little bit on the outside. And there are some tiny areas here. So I am using that number 2 round brush. And again, these are natural bristle brushes, so they hold a lot of water. If you were doing something like this and you wanted to make it nice and dark, you would want to use, you feel like you can't get the control with the natural brushes like I'm doing here, you might want to use a synthetic bristle brush. Those do not hold as much water, they hold more pigment, and they allow you to make a darker line. But on this, I felt that's the type of brush I'm talking about. That is a brush that has synthetic bristles, and that was the scrub brush that you saw right there. Normally I use the scrub brush to pick up different highlight areas, but I am going to be using this synthetic brush. It doesn't hold as much water. So and you'll see me wipe it on my hand. I'm really bad about wiping it on my hand to get extra drops of water off. But I'm using that to pick up some of the pigment on the leaf to create veins. Now I did this in a previous piece, the one I mentioned earlier of the pear, where I did this extensively on the leaves. There weren't as many veins on these leaves. The artist that did this piece did not do as many veins on the leaves. But I am going to come back through still and get some more details on this piece. All right, we have all of our color on. Now I need to pull out some of the highlights on the pears. And again, I am just using some of my soft bristled brushes. I'm not using the acrylic brush. And I'm getting some extra water off, wiping it on my hands there. And what this does is it reactivates the paint in those areas. And you will see it's starting to get lighter. And then what you're not seeing is over at the side, I am wiping it on a paper towel to remove some more water from the brush, and the brush will actually soak up some of that paint that we have reactivated, and that allows us to make all kinds of highlights on our piece. Now the scrub brush, the little short bristled white synthetic brush that I showed you earlier, it is really good for stuff like this, but I felt as if I could not get the roundness with that brush that I could with this one because it does have softer bristles. So I am using this brush to lift the highlights in the pears. As with my last piece, on these antique botanical studies, and some of these pieces that I looked at for reference were about 100 years old, the background of the pieces will have kind of a cream color. And whether it is because of old paper or by design, I'm not certain, but I felt like I wanted to add that into my piece. So that's what I'm doing here. And I am doing wet on dry, because I don't need to mix any colors. I'm simply adding one solid color to this piece, and I'm concentrating on the centers where the heavier pigment will be. And as you can see, I'm using water here to kind of feather that out to the outside. And there you have our final piece. If you have any questions about the tools that I've used or about my techniques, please put those in the comments down below. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps so much. Thanks so much for watching.